Okay. Hello. First of all, I have to apologize. There's electricians working in our house or on the roof, and uh, yeah, there may be noise. I don't know if you can hear it as well as I can, but um, also it means I don't have power right now, actually, so everything is running off the battery. And I'm using my phone for the internet connection. Hopefully that will all work fine, but just so you be aware, it might suddenly cut out or whatever. Okay. Um, so I'm going to talk about this book, first of all, The Unity of Science, or booklet. Um, Actually, I'm not sure. I don't remember what year. I have it right here. This English translation was published. 1934. Right. So this text itself was published in 1934, but the reason I wrote 1932 is that it's a translation of a long article that Carnap published in German in 1932, called Die physikalische Sprache als Universalsprache der Wissenschaft, the physical language as the universal language of science. Um, and yeah, then in 1934, he published it as a monograph in English, um, with a new introduction by himself and an introduction by the translator, and under the title "The Unity of Science." Um, so this is really just like 4 years after the Aufbau. The Aufbau was published in 1928. So not that much time has passed, but there've been important changes. Um, so one is this, I mean, this in itself, I don't think is exactly a change, but it's become much clearer that the object of philosophical theory as such is language. Um, so in this paper or book, that's um, emphasized by making this distinction between the material mode and the formal mode. Right, where mode is like a mode of speaking, a way of talking. There's a formal way of speaking and a material way of speaking. Um, Actually, in German, I forget what the word is, but he uses this material uses Inhalt, content, right? So it's the formal mode versus the contentful mode. Um, this is matter in the sense in which uh, the matter of representation is the object that it purports to represent, something like that. So this is the Cartesian sense. This corresponds to the Cartesian division between formal and objective reality. Um, or at least the way I understand Kant, to the difference between formal and transcendental in Kant. Um, so and uh, but here, of course, the representation in question, I mean, one of the things we'll see in the exchange with Neurath is that perhaps Carnap isn't as serious about this, what I'm about to say, as Neurath is, right? But the representation is not now being understood as a mental representation, as a mode of my mind, but as a linguistic item. So the formal mode is the mode that just discusses language as it is in itself, whereas the material mode talks about the objects, the meaning of language, right? What the language is supposed to be about. And Carnap says that in philosophy, the formal mode is the correct mode. The material mode is allowable because for various reasons, but it's dangerous. Right? So this is so in other words, philosophy correctly understood is just about languages um, uh, without talking about what it is that the language represents, or without talking about the objects that the language supposedly represents. Um, right. So he introduces this on page 37. In formulating the thesis of the unity of science as the assertion that objects are of a single kind, that states of affairs are of a single kind, we are using the ordinary fashion of speech in terms of objects and states of affairs. The correct formulation replaces objects by words and states of affairs by statements. For a philosophical, that is, a logical investigation, must be an analysis of language. And then he goes on to introduce these terms formal and material to describe that difference. Right. So an example of this, I mean, so right, so throughout the paper there are these passages where he gives the formal and material modes side by side. Um, and again, the formal mode is the philosophically correct way of saying it, but the material mode is useful because of the associations it has. It helps us understand what this comes to, something like that. But it's also dangerous because it tempts us to think that there's some subject matter outside language that philosophy is about. Right. So, an example on page 45. And I'm actually going to read, so he puts the formal mode on the left and the material mode on the right, but I'm going to read the material mode first. So the material mode says, the simplest statements in the protocol language refer to the given and describe directly given experiences or phenomena. That is, the simplest states of which knowledge can be had. And then question, what objects are the elements of given direct experience? So that's the ordinary way of talking about it. And it's also the way Carnap himself talked about it in the Aufbau. And now he gives the formal restatement of it. So the formal mode says the simplest statements in the protocol language are protocol statements, that is, statements needing no justification. Now, I mean, I think needing no justification, um, and again, this is going to come out somewhat in the exchange with Neurath, that he hasn't thought carefully enough about what to write here, that needing no justification could mean something like they're self-evident. I can see by intuition that they're true, something like that. Um, that by itself would already belong to the material mode, I think, according to Carnap. That doesn't really, that understanding of justification doesn't belong on the left-hand side. What needing no justification means is that you're allowed to write them down without writing something else that you derive them from. That's what you write in your protocol. right? The protocol is a list of sentences that aren't derived from anything. In other words, this is basically like the same thing I said in the Aufbau that when we think about the axiomatic system that would go together with the constructional system in the system of the Aufbau, what would the axioms be? And I think the answer is that the axioms would be like uh, the list of relation pairs of the basic relation. That is, the axioms would be all the empirical facts. Um, so if an axiom is a statement that, according to my rules of proof or derivation, is allowed to be written down without any proof, right? I mean, that's what an axiom is in arithmetic or whatever, right? Like if you do a formal proof, then for every step you need to say according to what rule of inference it was derived from which previous steps. But if it's an axiom, you can just write axiom, right? And you can put that down wherever you want. So that's what the protocol statements are. That's what it means, uh, requiring or needing no justification. So the simplest statements in the protocol language are protocol statements. That is, statements needing no justification and serving as foundation for all the remaining statements of science. So there's no more mention of the given, or of states of which we can, simple states of which we can have knowledge. That was all like a metaphysical interpretation of the simple fact that you're allowed to write these statements down without deriving them from anything. Um, and then the question is, what kinds of words occur in the protocol statements, right? Instead of what objects are the elements of given direct experience. Um, okay, so that's both an important point in itself, like what we're now taking protocol statement to mean. I mean, well, let me say what it is first, and then it's both an important fact in itself, what we're now taking protocol statements to mean, but it's also an example of this relationship between the formal and material mode. That you're saying the same thing on both sides, but the material side has this stuff that seems to refer to what the statements are about and to base the rules on that. Right? Like, why are you allowed to write them down without deriving them from anything? Because they're direct experience. So you don't need anything else to get them from. But the formal mode just contains the syntactic fact that you're allowed to write them down without deriving them from anything. And that's what philosophy really should talk about. Um, um, So I introduced this by saying that, this is improved clarity. I mean, again, I think if you look carefully at the Aufbau, you can see that he's already, at least in his more careful moments, more or less thinking this there. But it's not at all clear that that's what he means there. He spends most of his time in what he would call the material mode in the Aufbau. Um, so I introduced this by saying, well, so it's improved clarity about what the object of philosophical theory is, namely language. But actually, that has to be corrected a little bit because, strictly speaking, this formality is supposed to be a way of showing that philosophy has no theory. Um, he states that most clearly, but I think I didn't assign this in the introduction he wrote in 1934. Yeah, I did not assign this. that, which, I mean, this is one of the most radical statements of this in Carnap. It starts by saying, we in the Viennese circle are not philosophers, and we're not a school of philosophy, because a school of philosophy is supposed to be about some special subject matter, and it's supposed to have opinions about it. And we don't have that. We just do logical analysis. Um, so, like, okay, so we have to step back and say, how can that be? I mean, how can it both be that philosophy is about language and that philosophy isn't about anything? Isn't a language a physical thing or physical things, a physical system, right? There's like sounds and marks. Um, um, Now, I mean, I think Carnap definitely agrees with that. Although again, when I talk about Neurath, we'll see that maybe Carnap isn't as serious about that as Neurath is. um, but yeah, Carnap thinks language is an empirical, physical object, obviously. Um, and there's a science or sciences that study it, like linguistics. And they definitely have a subject matter, just like every science. So, philosophy is about language, but it has to be about language in some special way. Um, and the reason is that philosophy is supposed to say about those marks and sounds and whatever only tautologous things, right? As I think I mentioned before, if you don't already know this, strictly speaking, this is an example of a tautology. A is A, right? It's called a tautology because it's tautology really means the same word or the same logos, right? Which sometimes means word. But anyway, it's right, it's the same word twice. So uh you haven't added anything to my knowledge of A by saying this. Um, And you can see why this, in a certain sense, has no subject matter because it doesn't matter what A is, right? I don't have to know anything about what A is. So, like, it's um, it's purely formal in the sense that it has nothing to do with what the representation represents with its object or meaning. um, Whether we regard this as a mental representation, as in Kant's definition of general or formal logic, um, this is the type of thing that formal or general logic tells you. Things that don't depend on the object at all, but only depend on uh, um, what it takes for the representation to be consistent with itself, right? So whatever A is, if A is anything, that is assuming A is a meaningful term, um, this is definitely true. And it doesn't tell me anything about A that I don't already know. And I don't need to know anything about A to know that it's true. Um, so, uh, Now, I mean, this is a literal tautology. Um, but um, the Vienna Circle, but basically following Wittgenstein, in the Tractatus, although I don't think Wittgenstein is the first one to say this either. Um, but regards all logical truths as tautologies, right? The reason we know that, right? So this is no longer a tautology in the sense that it's just the same word twice. A is B or not A is B. Um, but at least this is Wittgenstein's understanding here. It's it's similar to this in that I don't get to know anything about what A and B are to know that it's true, and learning it doesn't tell me anything about A and B that I didn't already know. Um, And similarly for more complex, because, so remember at this point, they're working with understood somehow modern mathematical logic of the kind you learn in Phil 9. So it doesn't stop with this or that. It can get really long and complicated. It can be very hard to figure out if it's a logical truth or not. Um, uh, Nevertheless, once you figure it out, what you figure out when you figure it out is that in a sense, it doesn't tell you anything. That in a sense, it's just as much saying the same thing over again as A is A. Okay, so that's a tautology. And, I mean, like, first of all, the Wittgenstein and the Vienna Circle use that to understand what logic and also mathematics, because they think mathematics can be reduced to logic. So, what logic and mathematics are about, why it seems like we can know them a priori in advance of experience, or they don't depend on uh, experience, empirical observations, whatever. So, right, I mean, like, so one response for a radical empiricist faced with that question is to just deny it, right? So, like John Stuart Mill said, no, logic and arithmetic are empirical sciences too. Um, uh, but uh, if you don't want to say that, and there's a lot of problems with saying that. If you don't want to say that, but you also don't want to say that we have any way of gaining knowledge besides experience. So here's the way to do it. Say all of mathematics and logic is like this. And how do we learn it without any experience? Well, there's nothing to learn, basically. Right? These don't really, the information content of these is zero. So that's why you learn them from zero experience. Um, uh, right? That is all the various things you could know about A depend on particular experiences you could have of A, but not this one because this one doesn't tell you anything about A, and so no experience of A is enough to know it. Um, so Carnap is, and again, I think that this is already his view in the Aufbau, but here he's trying to be much clearer about it. He's saying that the things that philosophy says about language or languages are themselves tautologies. So it doesn't matter. So, like, none of the physical properties of linguistic items matter. So, like, here's an example. I'm going to erase this stuff now. suppose you have P, and by you have it, I mean like, so at least the fiction here is, I think you can look at it this way. There's a protocol that has all our observations in it. And again, as I mentioned last time, a protocol is basically a notebook, like a notebook where you write down minutes or observations or something like that. So we have the protocol that has this all these things written down that are going to function like axioms. And then we have like another book where we're doing our derivation, right? So we write things down in it. So suppose you've written down P. Now, I mean, here P, although, um, so there's another book that Carnap published around the same time, a little later, and there's actually a promise in this text that he's going to publish it soon, called The Logical Syntax of Language. In The Logical Syntax of Language, he's clearer about what I'm about to say. But here, like, P is what in that book he would call a syntactic variable, right? Like it stands for some sentence. We don't know what. So I've written down some sentence in my book, not in the protocol, but in the other book where I'm doing my derivation, right? I've written down some sentence P, and I've written down some other sentence Q. I mean, maybe I should use Greek letters for these to emphasize that they're syntactic variables. Except I think maybe some people aren't familiar with Greek letters, but oh well, you should be. All right, so, right, I've written down some sentence phi, and I've written down some other sentence psi. And I have a rule of inference that says this little turnstile here means, in this context, means the rule of inference is if you have these written down, you're allowed to write this. And this, I think I mentioned this before in this class. That's one of the ways of writing and. That's the one I find easiest to write. Right? Like I have a hard time writing an ampersand. It's kind of complicated. Um, but I mean, I guess if you remember that it's just the letters E and T, that is the Latin word et, kind of like squiggled together. It's easier to remember how to write it, but still, this is much easier, right? So if you, right, like if you have this and you have this, then you're allowed to write this. Um, Meaning, strictly speaking, you're allowed to write whatever sentence phi is, and then you're allowed to write this symbol, and then you're allowed to write whatever sentence psi is. So if you have these three things, then you can write that. So I hope you can see why, like, again, this is a tautology, right? Like this statement that that if you have this and you have this and you have this, you can write this, is like, doesn't tell you anything, doesn't depend on anything about what these variables actually refer to. Um, and Moreover, this is an example of this type of statement is an example of syntax. Syntax is a study of language with a view to questions of like what order you're allowed to write things down in, essentially. Right? So like both, within a sentence, how can the symbols be ordered to give you a grammatically correct sentence? Um, and in a broader context where you have lots of sentences, like what sentences are you allowed to transform? Like when, if you have a certain sentence, are you allowed to transform it into some other sentence? Or when, if you have a bunch of other sentences, are you allowed to transform them all into some other sentence? Right? Those are all syntactic questions. Um, and in this period, which is why he wrote this book called The Logical Syntax of Language. In this period, Carnap thinks that the formality of philosophy will involve replacing everything that looks like it's about what language means. So, right, I guess I should say there's another way you can study language. There's at least one other way. There's lots of other ways, but there's another way you can study language, which is called semantics, where you talk about what the words mean. Um, so in this period, Carnap thinks, I mean, I don't think I don't think he denies that you can study language from this point of view, what the words mean. Obviously you can, right? Um, but uh, but he thinks that study should be placed in empirical linguistics. Those statements are not tautologous. You have to know about the people who use the language and how they related to other things around them and whatever. And then you can start talking about what the words mean. And those will be empirical statements. Um, but so in this period, Carnap thinks that the formality or tautologous nature of philosophy consists in the fact that it everything in if something is really is a philosophical thesis, you should be able to take everything out that seems like it belongs to semantics, that seems like it has something to do with what words mean, right? So like, remember in that example I read before, the material mode started, the simplest statements in the protocol language refer to the given, right? That refer to is the semantic part. Carnap in this period thinks that the formality of philosophy means that everything in a truly philosophical thesis that looks like it's semantics actually can be taken out, and the whole thing can be put as a syntactic thesis, right? So again, the formal mode of that example, the simplest statements in the protocol language are protocol statements. That is, statements needing no justification. And what I explained there in this terminology, basically, that needing no justification for Carnap here is a syntactic fact, right? It's not that they need no justification because of something special about the objects they're referring to. It's that they need no justification because the syntactic rules of the language allow you to write them down without anything else written before them. So they allow you, so to speak, to transform the empty sentence into them. Right? That's one way of looking at what an axiom is. It's like what you're allowed to write down after no sentence. The empty set of premises, I guess would be the right way to put it. Oh, I noticed that Josephine wrote at 11:09. I never heard anyone pronounce those like that before. Which? What? Syntax?
Phi and psi and not
Oh,
phi and psi.
that, I mean, uh, there's a lot of different ways of pronouncing Greek. Um, uh, Usually none of them, I mean, you rarely hear people try to pronounce it the way it was actually pronounced in classical Athens. I, I do think the vowel was E, and it's if you see these letters written out in Greek, it'll be written with an iota, which we pronounce iota, not iota, but which made the sound E, right? So anyway, that's a long story short, phi and phi are just two different ways of pronouncing the same letter. All right. Uh, and I'm not claiming to have an authentic because I mean actually so like this letter was not called phi, it was called p. You probably can't hear the aspiration of the p that I just did, but p as opposed to this letter, which was called p without the aspiration. All right. Anyway, I'm not trying going to try to do that. Yes, John.
So I'm just seeing if I'm like connecting concepts correctly. Like one way that I'm thinking about this is that Carnap thinks that um, philosophy is trying to look at language and ask the question, can it be translated into a Ramsey sentence? Is that like an accurate analysis? Because the what you're talking about with like taking out all of the semantical um, details in the sentence seems like it maps onto a Ramsey sentence, but I'm not sure.
So Ramsey sentence. Okay, I mean, so first of all, Ramsey is after this. I mean, not too much actually. When did Ramsey write that stuff? I don't know, but anyway, uh, uh, I see why you're saying that. I'm trying to, and I don't think it's literally right, but I'm trying to think about what the connection actually is. Because, okay, so for people who don't know, now I may get this wrong because I haven't thought about exactly what a Ramsey sentence is for a little while at least. Um, but it's like if you suppose you have a theory, T X. And like again, we could understand this. This is really a syntactic variable, and I mean, this whole thing is an expression meaning some long theory that you state somehow in terms of the variable x. Or maybe I should say rather than the variable x. Yeah, that's probably the right way to say it. This is like a proper name. I say theory is true of A, some long complicated theory, and think this is what's called a Ramsey sentence. I may be confusing with the Carnap sentence, but basically you existentially quantify the thing the theory is about. So now you're just saying there's something such that this theory is true of it. John, is that your theory? Is that what you're thinking a Ramsey sentence is, or am I getting it wrong?
Yeah, yeah, that's how I understand it.
Right. Okay. So that's certainly a way of abstracting from the content of something. Um, but the way Carnap is abstracting from the content, like, so if we took this same thing and talked about understanding it semantically versus understanding it syntactically, so understanding it semantically would mean knowing what A refers to and what all the other terms of the theory refer to. And therefore understanding something about what the world has to be like if this theory is going to be true. So you notice in the transition to the Ramsey sentence, uh, that's still the case, right? I mean, now it's not a matter of knowing what A refers to, but it's still a matter of knowing all the things that X might refer to.
Oh, okay.
But
I'm
you
good.
can still you can understand either of these semantically. Or on the other hand, you can understand either of them syntactically, and then all you pay attention to is the order in which the symbols are written. And what transformations you're allowed to do because of that. So, like, it's a syntactic rule that if you write this, you're then allowed to write that, right? That's called existential generalization or existential something. I don't know. Anyway, right? That's one of the rules of inference that usually you would give when you introduce um, predicate calculus or quantified logic. You would you would list as a rule of inference that if you have this, you're allowed to write that, right? So um, for that, you don't need to know anything about what any of these symbols might refer to. In fact, you don't even have to know that they refer to anything in a sense, right? That I mean, I think actually Nico Orlandi teaches logic this way. That to begin with, Nico like introduces as a game about how you're allowed to transform certain symbols. um, right? Like a syntactic understanding of what's going on here would be like that. It could just as well be that, like the rule that when you're playing tic-tac-toe, if you have this, you're allowed to write this. you know, so that's a syntactic rule. I got a new easel, but the new easel turned out to be really crappy, so I'm still using the old one, which is broken, and that's the way it is. Right. So, right, so this is also a syntactic rule. But here there is no semantics, right? Like the X on the tic-tac-toe board doesn't refer to anything. Um, okay, so does that make it? So, I mean, I think I still haven't answered the question as well as I should because I just explained why these are two like completely different ways of abstracting from the content. But of course, they can't be completely different since they are both ways of abstracting from the content. I ought to be able to explain how they related or something, but I don't know what else to say about it now. All right. Um, but I hope that's helpful, not just for people who are worried about the Ramsey sentence, but like to clarify more what this distinction is. The reason I'm spending so much time on this distinction, and maybe it's a bad reason for the purposes of this course, but it's a good reason for the purpose of knowing about Carnap, is that and knowing about the development of logical positivism, analytic philosophy in general, that later on, not that much later, Carnap, along with a lot of other people, was exposed to Tarski's theory of truth. And at that point, Carnap and a lot of other people, including Popper, who we're going to read later, suddenly, so like from this point of view, asking whether a sentence is true or false is like belongs to the material mode. Philosophy shouldn't talk that way, right? We just ask whether the sentence, whether we're allowed to write the sentence in our book. um, uh, but after Tarski's theory of truth, which I think everyone who read it understood differently what Tarski had shown. I mean, that is everyone who like it's clear from some mathematical point of view what Tarski had shown, but everyone who read it understood differently what the philosophical content of it was. Um, if you haven't heard of Tarski, you should. So I'll write his name in, but I don't have his dates or anything. His first name was Alfred. At least that's what he was called in English. His first name was really something Polish. All right. Anyway, um, right. So after Tarski, I mean, after Tarski's theory of truth became available in languages that people could read, not just Polish, um, it changed everyone's mind. And they suddenly decided that truth was a perfectly good, in some sense, formal concept. And they introduced something called formal semantics, which from the point of this point of view is like a contradiction in terms. What do you mean formal semantics? Right? Because I said formal means it's only about the linguistic items as such and not about what they refer to. Okay, Josephine says, oh, right. It's his last name that was different in Polish. Right. His last name was titled, I don't know how you actually pronounce it in Polish, although it's obviously a German word, not Polish, Teitelbaum. All right. Anyway, uh, sorry, that's really not relevant. Um, so like thanks thanks to this re-understanding of what kind of logic was properly formal, it was properly logic. Like nowadays when we teach logic, and I don't know exactly how Nico works this in, but nowadays when we teach logic, usually we teach a um, semantic version of logic, where, for example, uh, rather than saying that a logical truth is a statement you're allowed to write down no matter what you've written in your protocol, um, we say a logical truth is a statement that's true in all models, right? Meaning, no matter how you interpret, whatever you think the names in it refer to or the variables in it refer to, it will always come out true. So you understand why that's a semantic definition of logical validity. It says, you know, it's a statement that's true no matter what's true in the world that the statement is about. No matter how you rearrange the items in the world the statement is about, it will still be true. That's a semantic version of logical validity, whereas a syntactic version of logical validity says you only need logical axioms, which you're allowed to write down because they're axioms. And from that, you can derive this statement. All right. And then there arises a whole project of showing that the two match up, right? That is, that all and only, hopefully, all and only the statements that can be derived syntactically are the ones that will be semantically valid. All right. Anyway, that's all in the future at this point. And moreover, it's not, we are going to see something about truth again in Popper, I think, in passing, and well, and a lot in Kuhn. So Tarski's relevant to that. Probably not at all. But in any case, um, but we're not going to read anything from Carnap's semantic period or anything like that. So that's just a historical footnote. Also, I guess, I mean, also to help you connect this, if you have been exposed to logic introduced in a semantic way, to help you connect that to the way Carnap is thinking here, because it's not exactly the same. Okay, so that was all about the first point I wanted to make, and I better speed up or I won't get to Neurath. About the first point I wanted to make about how things have changed here, namely that there's more clarity and specificity to the idea that philosophy is really about the structure of languages. This is what Carnap means by it at this period. It's logical syntax, it's formal syntax. It's about, what you would be able to write in a language if these were the rules of the language. Okay, that's one thing that's going on here. Are there questions about that before I go on? Okay. All right. So another thing that's going on here is physicalism. I think um no, I have to say something about this. So I mostly left out of the assignment the parts of the paper that talk about physicalism. Right? Like I mean they would be important to read, but it's too long, so I didn't put them in. But basically, what physicalism comes down to for Carnap here is recommending a physical basis for your constructional system. So this is what I promised over and over when reading the Aufbau, how a little bit later Carnap would say, no, a system with a physical basis is better. Um, and why? Well, officially, at least, it's because the physical basis is universal and intersubjective. That is, like, everyone can say the same things in the language with the physical basis and mean the same thing by it. Whereas an autopsychological basis, at least so it appears, with an autopsychological basis, the basic objects and the basic relations that my autopsychological system is based on are different from the ones that your autopsychological system are based on. So when we each reduce it to our own basis, we end up saying things that don't connect with each other at all. And that has obvious disadvantages. So that's at least officially why the physical basis is so much better. Supposedly, it can be used as a basis, that is, everything can be translated into it, and it's intersubjective. Um, I think there's also something going on between Carnap and Neurath here. So when I get to Neurath, I'm going to say, I guess I'm going to say it now. Now I'm getting to Neurath already. So that right, Carnap is a socialist, but some kind of democratic socialist, but he's not a Marxist, whereas Neurath is a thinks of himself anyway as a more or less orthodox Marxist. So for Marxism, obviously, materialism is like one of the main tenets, right? You're supposed to be it's dialectical materialism. You're supposed to be a materialist. And Neurath interprets that as what he calls physicalism. So I think part of what's going on here is a negotiation between Carnap and Neurath, where Neurath is um, where Carnap is trying to give Neurath as much as he can towards Neurath's opinion. But as Neurath is going to turn around and point out, what Carnap means by physicalism here is still ideological from a Marxist point of view, or anyway, from Neurath's Marxist point of view. um, so, um, but still, I think that's also part of what's going on here, for reason for this switch. But but it's the important consequence, or maybe this is also one of the reasons for it, is this retreat from verificationism. Because so on this new system with a physical basis, we still have one constructional system. So here's its basis, but now this is like electrons and stuff. Let's say. Particles, fields, whatever. So this system establishes the unity of science, or if it were finished, it would establish the unity of science, because whatever science you get up here, like let's say economics. Now, I mean, this might already seem like it's trouble from a Marxist point of view. And I think that may actually be part of like an undercurrent in Neurath's criticism. Carnap says economics can definitely be reduced to physics, but not vice versa. Economics is not a universal science. All right. But anyway, so economics, let's say, occurs up here somewhere. All the statements of economics can be transformed into statements about the physical basis, about particles and fields, and so on for all the other sciences. So there's really only one unified science. Meanwhile, the same structure is also supposed to show that all the statements of unified science are empirically meaningful. That is verifiable. But now, so in the Aufbau, where the basis was autopsychological, the unification of science and the demonstration that science was empirically meaningful were the exact same process. The same reduction was both. Right? Like to show that economics is empirically meaningful, I could translate it into statements about my experiences. And now I know how to tell whether any economic statement is true or false in principle. Now the unification of science doesn't establish empirical uh, verifiability or empirical meaningfulness. How is it done? Well, instead it's done by showing that every statement everywhere in this structure has implications for a special part of it, or it's something that's isomorphic to a special part of it anyway, which is my protocol language. So it's not true that every statement about economics, so like this is my protocol language, this is a part of this structure that's isomorphic to my protocol language. What is it about? Well, it's probably about my brain states or something, as Carnap understands it, right? But there's a one-to-one correspondence between, that's what isomorphic means, between the items in my protocol language and the items in this area here. It's not the case that any statement in economics or physics or whatever can be transformed into a statement that's in this region. That would correspond to what he's trying to do in the Aufbau. That would mean strict verifiability, right? Every statement of economics means the same as some statement about my experiences. That is, some statement about some special class of my brain states or whatever. But it is supposed to be the truth that every statement of economics has some inferential relation to something in here. So this is actually a much weaker version of verificationism. In general, I can't tell from my experience whether this statement is true or false. But what I can do is look at this statement and say, well, if it's true, what do I expect to experience? And so I can, as Carnap puts it, either confirm or refute it based on my experience. But but that's not nearly the same as having it just be about my experience and nothing else. Okay, and I'm emphasizing this partly because I'm gonna have time. I'm gonna talk about what Neurath means by physicalism, but also because when we get to Quine, it's one of the questions that Quine's criticism raises, or maybe one of the problems about Quine's criticism is that Quine seems to describe the project the Aufbau as only making sense because it all goes back to my experiences and it's like one thing. And this deviation, which occurs only 4 years later, Quine is going to say this already, he's just confused. There's no point in doing this. Um, okay. Um, and Okay, so those are basically changes that have happened from the Aufbau to this, but on the other hand, some things haven't changed. I think from the fact that they haven't changed, you can conclude something about how important they were to Carnap in the first place, right? And one is the unity of science. Like on reading the Aufbau, it might not be obvious that the unity of science is really the main thing that we're trying to show there. But again, it's once the Aufbau project, in a sense, is abandoned and replaced by something much weaker, there's still this insistence on showing the unity of science, right? So that obviously is something that's important to Carnap in its own right, not just as a means to verificationism. And the other thing that also is constant is objection to metaphysics, attempt to show that it's empirically meaningless. Um, and I guess finally, this is the thing, or this is part of the thing that I said was becoming clearer, that philosophy is anti-metaphysical because um, so it has this logical, not tautologous non-content, right? What's the point of all of that, though? Um, well, the point is, I think, that we have to choose what language to speak. And before we choose that, we better know what the logical properties of the language we're going to choose are. So, right, this is an interpretation of that thing that comes out at the end of the Aufbau, that philosophy basically has no content because it's practical rather than theoretical. That's now being understood to mean, and I think even there is really understood to mean, philosophy is practical because it tells you how to choose a language. It tells you how to choose a language that's going to be suitable to express the truths of unified science and not to express the pseudo propositions of metaphysics. Okay. Um, Now I'm going to talk about Neurath, unless there are questions about what I just said. Okay. Um, so Otto Neurath, I mean, he's not one of the main figures in the course, but we're going to see him twice here criticizing Carnap and later criticizing Popper. Um, he was a member of the Vienna Circle, as you can tell from how he and Carnap talk to each other. That is, I probably should have said, although maybe this isn't as clear in the Unity of Science as it is in the exchange between Carnap and Neurath about the unity of science. And again, of course, it's not, the exchange is not about the English book that was published in 1934. The exchange is about the German paper, um, um, whatever it was called. Physikalsprache als Universalsprache der Wissenschaft or something like that. All right. So, uh, I didn't write down Neurath's dates here. I don't know. You can look them up on Wikipedia as well as I can. uh, he was, but obviously, as a contemporary of Carnap, is um, um, oh, and so what I was about to say is another thing that hasn't changed from the Aufbau. Oh, here we go. 1882 to 1945. Yeah, he died relatively young, and soon after he had fled Germany to, I think he ended up in Sweden, maybe. Um, but I mean, obviously, socialists and Marxists had to leave Germany, right? Um, but part of the history of later analytic philosophy is determined by like where different German philosophers ended up and how long they lived there and how many, how many students they had when they were there, English speaking students. Um, so like people who died relatively soon after they moved had much less influence on the tradition going forward, both within analytic philosophy and like Ernst Cassirer, who was the main inheritor of Marburg neo-Kantianism, uh, moved to the U.S., but uh, he didn't live here very long and didn't have a lot of students here. And so Marburg neo-Kantianism, at least this is probably part of the reason, Marburg neo-Kantianism kind of fizzled out without leaving a descendant. In my reading, some people think of Carnap as a descendant of, so it all depends how you understand history. Anyway, sorry, that's probably too much about Neurath, and I still didn't finish my sentence. That one thing that hasn't changed from the Aufbau is the idea that we're all collaborating together on a project. This isn't going to be like the old bad philosophy where people build up the fundamental parts of the system over and over. And oh, our power just went on, yay. and um, and never get to working out the details. In Kuhn's terms, but Kuhn has a different diagnosis, very different, perhaps very different diagnosis of why this happens. But in Kuhn's terms, like philosophy is going to make the transition to be like a normal science. um, we'll see what that means when we get to Kuhn. But right, so Carnap and Neurath are both very committed to this. At the same time, this exchange between Carnap and Neurath is a perfect example of why it never happened. Right? As long as logical positivism went on, they kept debating these basic questions about what empiricism means and what physicalism means and what an observation sentence is and so on and so forth. They never got to the grand project of unifying all of science. In fact, Kuhn's logic of scientific discovery was supposed to be a contribution to something called the Encyclopedia of Unified Science. That's why he originally wrote it. That would have been yet another complete overturning of what everyone else said before in the Encyclopedia of Unified Science. Right. So, all right. Now a little bit more though about like what's specific to Neurath. So I mentioned his Marxism. That like it really like what that means to him at least really comes across in this paper. So the first thing is that Carnap says philosophy is about language, and yeah, language is an empirical thing, but what we're talking about is just the logic of a possible language or something like that. And moreover, I probably shouldn't have raised that big right? Because that big thing is Carnap's system language. We don't have the system language, right? Just as in the Aufbau with the autopsychological basis, so with the physical basis, we don't actually know how to do these reductions. Moreover, if we had the system language, we couldn't use it. Right? Because these reductions would be so complicated that we couldn't actually write them down or understand them or anything like that. So what is the point of this? In what sense is this a language? And in what sense are the protocol sentences actually sentences? There isn't really a protocol they're written down in. It's a kind of sentence that we would let someone write down in a protocol, right? Like if there really was this language and so on and so forth. From Neurath's point of view, that's all ideology, right? It's Neurath takes very seriously that a protocol sentence is an actual sentence that someone writes down on a piece of paper in their protocol. And so Neurath raises questions like this. Suppose we have this scribe, Kalon. I guess that's how you're supposed to pronounce it. I don't know. It's a Greek name. I'm not sure if he's alluding to something. Anyway, suppose we have this scribe, Kalon, who's able to write with both hands simultaneously. And he writes, with one hand, he writes at so and so time. The only thing, sorry, that's electrician noises. I don't know if you can hear them, but I can. The only thing in the room with Kalon is a table. And with the other hand, at the same time, he writes in the same protocol, the only thing at time so and so in the room with Kalon is a bird. So now the protocol contains two sentences that contradict each other. Now what? Right? Like, I mean, Carnap just isn't thinking of the protocol that way. In response to Neurath, he starts thinking about it more that way, or he tries to understand how the way he's thinking about it relates to that. But originally, he's not thinking about it that way at all. Right? Yeah, you're allowed to write protocol sentences without deriving them from anything. But we just assume the protocol contains really a lot of, as a fiction, we assume it contains really a lot, like all of the observations I've made, right? Just as in the Aufbau, we assumed I had a name for every experience I ever had, and I have them all written down in tables, according like pairs of the basic relation. Um, and and yeah, of course, we assume they're consistent with each other. We certainly don't ask like, how is the subject A going to have time to write down all those things or anything like that? Um, so I think Neurath is right to point out that Carnap is not really thinking about language as a material thing here, as an empirical thing. This is a practical proposal for rules that could be the rules of an empirically spoken language when you abstract from all the reasons why they couldn't be. um, but for Neurath, um, um, this is an actual language. Only natural languages are material empirical things, and these proposed possible languages are just ideas. Um, so philosophy should be about the real language that we really have to speak and that we really should speak. So this also explains, for example, on page 207, Neurath says, um, in opposition to Carnap's methodological solipsism, right? So solipsism means only I and my experiences exist. That's a metaphysical thesis that Carnap is going to reject, right? That has no empirical consequences. That's the whole point of it. How do I know that anyone else exists? My experiences would be the same whether they exist or not. So Carnap says, aha, that shows that you don't mean anything by the question. If your experiences would be the same one way or the other, you don't know what you're saying. Right. So, but methodological solipsism, according to Carnap, means, yeah, everyone has their own protocol and they're allowed to write their protocol sentences in their protocol and not someone else's protocol sentences. So Neurath says on page 207, Neurath must describe Neurath's, right, talking about himself in the third person or using himself as an example. Neurath must describe Neurath's protocol in a manner analogous to that in which he describes Calonne's. He describes how Neurath's protocol looks to him, as well as how Calonne's does. Right? So the point is, like, once I've written something in my protocol, that's a publicly available material object. I have the same relationship to it as everyone else does. Not exactly the same relationship because you're standing over there and I'm here, but the point is like um, I'm allowed to do, if I'm allowed to do something with it, then you should be allowed to do the same thing with it. Um, so this idea that I have my own protocol language that only I'm allowed to write in my protocol doesn't make any sense. Or it does make sense, but only as part of a certain mode of production in which people claim certain material objects for their own. Um, and that's what we're against. Right. So I haven't quite got to that yet, though, because I want to say one more thing that's an example of how seriously Neurath is thinking of the language, our language, as a bunch of words written down or spoken. And this is something he says on page 203. He's going to say this even more strongly in his response to Popper, that one of the main ways to deal with contradiction within the system of science is to change the meaning of the terms while keeping the sentence the same. Right? So, like, if we have the sentence, mass is conserved, maybe that's not a great example. Where's the momentum? We have the sentence, momentum is conserved, written down in our in his critique of Popper. Neurath is going to talk about encyclopedias. So written down in our encyclopedia is somewhere is this sentence, momentum. This says momentum. Momentum is conserved. Now we look at particles going really fast in a particle accelerator. And we find, these two particles go in and these two come out. And we add up the momentum of this one and the momentum of this one. And we find that it's not the same as the momentum of this one and the momentum of that one. So momentum isn't conserved. But actually, that's not what we say. We say, well, relativistically, what momentum is so and so. And momentum is conserved. Right? That is, the momentum for vector is conserved. Now, I mean, from some logical point of view, under some understanding of what a language and the logic of a language are, that's completely screwed up. Right? Like you made your old sentence still be true by redefining this term. Um, that's a fallacy of equivocation. And Neurath, sounding very paradoxical in that other paper, is going to say that, yeah, uh, philosophy, science progresses by tertia, no, sorry, by, what's the term? Quaternio terminorum, right? That is by the false syllogism of four terms where you change the meaning of the middle term as you go. Um, so, I mean, but from Neurath's point of view, this makes sense because science is about manipulating these written things. And yeah, sometimes it's good if we can retain the same thing and use it for a new purpose. That's what's going on here. That's convenient. Um, Okay, but now something else, but I've already kind of said some of this because I got out of order, is that you know, this is the materialism, but then there's also this. Philosophers have tried to understand the world. The point, however, is to change it, right? So again, from Norna's point of view, Carnap's diddling around with possible languages is at best a waste of time. Um, even though he's so respectful to him, because we're both members of the collaborative Vienna circle, and eventually we're going to get on to our positive project and whatever, the implied criticism is pretty harsh, right? Spend all your time on this describing this language that no one's ever going to speak. How is that going to help anyone? What we need to do is settle on the correct language, teach it to children, make sure they grow up speaking it, and police to make sure that, like, as he puts it at one point, younger men don't slide back into speaking a metaphysical language. Um, uh, make sure everyone speaks this new language that we're setting up. So it better be a language we have right now. It can't be some language that in principle we could have. And one of the projects Neurath actually spent a lot of time on was he invented this like symbolic language um, that he uh, was supposed to allow you to say, I mean, a lot of it was to allow you to say things like about labor and the boss and whatever, right? But anyway, it was supposed to allow you to say everything in this neutral, symbolic way. And then, like, he went to factories and tried to teach the workers to use this symbolic language he had invented. Um, and actually, it turns out the guy I mentioned, who I saw, who recognized me in Trader Joe's and said that he was looking for information about Otto Neurath, he explained to me that his his other job when he's not working at Trader Joe's is he's an artist, and he was really interested in Neurath's symbolic language. So I guess Neurath's symbolic language lives on, but it has never been adopted by factory workers, to my to my knowledge. Right. Anyway, um, so there's kind of a weird and maybe important little paradox hidden in there. Um, Carnap's apparently pointless fooling around with ideal languages didn't have an effect on workers in factories that much, really, probably. But it had a big effect on the future trajectory of philosophy, at least. Probably in the social sciences too. Neurath's like symbolic language that was going to liberate the workers didn't really amount to anything. All right. Anyway, never mind that. Um, So to put both these together and summarize them, um, um, that book that we're writing things down in, according to Neurath, is like a real book, basically, or a bunch of real books. And it's the product of our labor. We make assertions in the same way that we make widgets. Um, right? In one sentence, this is on page 206, Neurath says, the fact that men generally retain their own protocol sentences more obstinately than they do those of other people is a historical accident which is of no real significance for our purposes. I shouldn't be more attached to my own protocol sentences than everyone else's. I'm not sure if that's very orthodox Marxist sentiment, but I'm not sure. I'm not really expert. It sounds a little, isn't that being alienated from a, well, I don't know. Anyway, so right, and that is Neurath's understanding of communism is I shouldn't be more attached to quote unquote my protocol sentences than anyone else's just because I happen to write them down. And then, in fact, he describes this kind of assertion factory with a machine, which I guess rather than being owned by a capitalist is going to be owned by all of us, you know, or not owned at all, depending how you understand communism. And everyone's protocol sentences are going to be like dumped into the hopper, and assertions are going to come out. um, And in what language is it going to be? Well, it's going to be in this language that Neurath calls the universal slang. He actually uses the English word slang. I think he's maybe not that clear about what slang means. Probably pigeon would be a better word here than slang, universal pigeon, because like it's a combination of the precise language of science with imprecise phrases like Otto and Uncle Rudy, right? Uncle Rudy is Carnap, Rudolph Carnap. um, uh, and you know, we can't get rid of those vague conglomerations or ballings of language. Um, uh, I mean, Carnap would agree that we can't get and shouldn't get rid of them for practical purposes. But for Carnap's point of view, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be eliminated from the ideal system language that we're talking about, that we're intending to translate our words into. Um, And in the universal slang, there will be no protocol sentences in Carnap's sense. That is, there won't be any sentences that are not subject to revision. Because now we understand it's not just a matter of Calonne writing two things with both hands. Like everyone's protocol sentences all go into the hopper. If some of them contradict each other, we're going to have to choose which one. So protocol sentences are going to be no less subject to verification and revision than anything else. I have left, there's more to say about Neurath, but I've left only 5 minutes to talk about Carnap's response to Neurath, which is unfortunate. But I guess uh, Carnap's response has two parts. On the one hand, he allows large parts of Neurath's criticism um, in two different ways. That is, first, I think he rephrases the way that he was proposing to do things in the unity of science um, in a way that is much closer to what Neurath demands. And, you know, he says, well, my real idea was that protocol sentences are outside the system language. That's why I already drew it like as isomorphic to something inside, not literally something inside. In the original paper, it's not that clear. I thought of protocol language as something outside the system language. We have rules for translating them into the system language. And he says, so sure enough, we never have to revise, because of what happens in science, we never have to revise what went on in these because we just changed the translation. But the change in the translation may be rather drastic. Like we had first translated this sentence as it is now raining. And instead we're going to translate it as um, Cologne now thinks it's raining, unless Cologne is lying. Right? It's going to be something like that. Um, uh, right? So whereas before it would be a contradiction for it is now raining to be written down in Cologne's protocol when it wasn't raining, right? Where it is now raining is some physical state of affairs. Now it's not a contradiction because we translate this into it looks like from Cologne's point of view, it's raining, or Cologne is lying, or Cologne is hallucinating, or right, this whole long complicated thing. And now, sure enough, that no longer contradicts the physical fact that it's not raining. But obviously, in some sense, there's been something like a revision of a protocol sentence. Then he also provides, but I won't have time to talk about this in detail. He also provides a kind of paraphrase of Neurath into his own way of thinking, where Neurath is now proposing taking some of the sentences in the system's language itself as protocol sentences. And Carnap says, yeah, you could do that. That's a different convention, right? That's a different choice of language. And if you do that, yeah, sure enough, you'll have to let them be revised. And he explains how that's also a perfectly valid way of doing the same thing he was trying to do. Um, how close that is to Neurath is, I mean, it doesn't at all get back the idea that languages, that assertions are products of our labor and they're not our property and so on and so forth. Um, um, the final thing, though, that Carnap does is in describing the difference between those approaches, he says, well, an advantage of my approach, original approach, is tolerance. Because I can let Cologne and Otto and Uncle Rudy and all these people write whatever they want in their protocols. It's always going to be acceptable because it's not part of my language. So like it can't contradict anything that I say or think, and I have no grounds for criticizing it. It just presents me with the task of trying to translate it into my language. Maybe at some point, this isn't so clear. At some point, some of these things are going to have to be rejected as metaphysical. Those weren't really part of the protocol language. I don't know how that works. But in any case, it's pretty tolerant in the sense that I can let these people speak however they want. Carnap says Neurath's proposal also has certain advantages, but it requires that I train these people to speak our language. And then he just says, this is a process of conditioning that sometimes works with humans and other animals and other times not. And I think you can hear very muted there that there's a political response to Neurath. Right? He's saying something like, Carnap also quotes the thing about younger men deviating and like scare quotes elsewhere in the paper. He's saying that, yeah, your approach might be convenient in some ways, but it's inconvenient in the sense that it requires me to treat everyone else like an animal and try to train them using stimuli to speak my language. Maybe there's something a little inconvenient about that. All right. That's all I have time to say, and more than I had time to say. And I will see you on Thursday back in Santa Cruz. Thanks for coming, those who came.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, those who watch.
Thank
Bye.
you.